This is Jenny Kunkel, and in this video we are going to cover subqueries. And the way that we can use a subquery is we can use it in a where statement, we can use it in a having statement, we can use it in a from statement, and we can use it from the select clause. Let's go ahead and let's take a look at the first example, and we're going to start with the select clause. Let's go to SQL Server Management Studio. I'm going to go ahead and open a new query window, and this is going to essentially be where we want to retrieve the count of the departments for each department and name and group. So if I would go through and create a select statement, I really just want to be selecting from the department table, but I also want to add in that aggregate function and get a total using a subselect. And what we mean by subselect is we have a query within a query. That's what we mean by a subselect. And in this case, we're going to start by coding out our human resources department. So this is going to be select department ID, the name, and the group name. This is going to be from our human resources department. Now I want to be able to reference the department ID within the subquery that I use, so I need to alias our table, and we're going to get a d.department ID, d.name, and d.group name. Then I want to go ahead and I want to add a subquery, and my subquery that I'm going to be using is going to be selecting the count from the department table for each of the individual departments. So I can say select count from the human resources employee department history and give this an alias of EDH. And this is going to be where my end date is null and my EDH dot department ID is going to be equal to my D dot department ID. So only when they match is it going to provide a count. And I'm going to alias this as total emps in department. And I can execute this query, and it's going to give me, for engineering, I have 6. There was one person that had an end date of null. I have 4 for my tool design. Very similar to what we saw when we were using the over clause with our aggregate functions. We can achieve that same type of thing with our subquery that we're using in our select statement. Now, if we decide that we want to try to do a subquery from within our from statement, what does that look like? In some cases, we might want to try to refine and select like a portion of a result based off of some specific condition. And in our case, we are just going to try to take a look at our employee table and only try to join in those records from that human resources job candidates table where they have a business entity that is not null. If we recall, we have 2 records in our job candidate table that people were hired. There was like, I think, 13 records total. So we had 11 candidates that were not hired, 2 that were hired. And if we decide that we want to filter out and only get those 2 records and then join those 2 records to the employee tables, we can do that from a subquery in the from statement. So let's do that. This is going to be e.business entity ID. We want to get the e.login ID. We're not going to go ahead and join in the person. We're just going to get the job title. And we also want to get the job candidate ID. This is going to be from human resources dot employee. This is our E prefix for our table, and we want to do an inner join, but instead of using the table, we want to do a select. And this is going to be where we get our business entity ID and our job candidate ID. We are selecting the job candidate ID from our select statement, and we also need to be able to join these two tables together. So we need to at least select these two fields from our human resources dot job candidate table. We want to only select those where we have a business entity ID that is not null. So that should filter it out. I only have two records being returned that I'm joining, and then I'm going to alias that as JC, and then I can go ahead and specify my on condition, which is the e.businessEntityID, which I have joined to the selected jc.businessEntityID. Once I run this query, it should give me essentially the same type of results as if I did an inner join on those two tables and I joined the table directly. That's going to give me the intersection. So I can filter out everything. In this case, it would be joining just on the two records that are in the job candidate table after it executed that select statement, versus if it joined the whole entire table, that it would have 13 records. Maybe not the best solution for doing a subselect from within a from statement, but it is kind of a simple example to try to understand. And then if we move on and we want to try to do it from maybe a having statement, if we look at maybe doing something where we're looking at our work order, if we go down to our work order, we can get our wo.product ID and the sum of our scrapped quantity from our production.work order. We want to return this where we have our scrapped quantity value is not null. So we want to overlook any of the records where our work orders have not scrapped any material. In this case, we just want to look at the ones where they have scrapped material. This is going to be grouped by our wo.product ID. Once I have that done, I want to use a having, and this is going to be on the sum of my scrapped quantity. And I want to only select those where I have the sum of the scrap quantity greater than, using a subselect, the average scrapped quantity on all orders from the production.work order table. And once I have that coded, I can run that query and execute it. And it's essentially going to give me just all of the products where I have a scrapped quantity greater than the average scrapped quantity. Now, if I decide that I want to do it in the where statement, and I have a couple different ways that I can do that. And let's use our example where we had the job candidate and the employee. And one of the easiest ways to look at it from within the where statement is we're going to get a list of values returned from the select. And we want to check to see if we have a value in our query results that is part of the subselect that's being returned for a particular field. In this case, we can say, is the value in this list that's being returned? So I can go ahead and say that I want to select, so let's do the same type of list that we have up here, not including that job candidate ID. We want to select that from our human resources table for the employee. And we want this where we have our e.business entity ID in, if we go ahead and use a select statement, this is going to be select the business entity ID, and going to the next line from our human resources dot job candidate. Let's call this JC, where the e.business entity ID is going to be equal to the JC.business entity ID. This is what we want to select, and I'm going to go ahead and just be very specific here and say that we're going to be selecting this, the JC business entity ID. Now, if we go ahead and select this, we probably are going to be looking at records that have null. So if we execute that, we have a lot of null records. So we probably want to add an additional qualifier here, so we're not processing quite as much data. And this is going to be where our JC.business entity ID is not null. So when it's not null, we're going to have less records that are being selected, the 2, and then I can check to see whether I have records in my employee table that have a value of 212 or 274. Is the value that I have in my results set that's coming back that I want to filter, is it in 212, 274? If it is, then I'm going to include it in the results set. Otherwise, I'm not. So I can go ahead and execute it, and I'm going to get the 2 matches. If I want to take a look and see the employees that do not have records in the job candidates table, I could use a not in, and then that would return to me the list of employees that are not in that job candidate table. So that's going to give me that option. Now, I can also do this using a where exists or not exists. And that's going to be very similar. So I'm going to go ahead and copy at least the start of this, paste it down below. And I can say I want to grab the human resource employee where exists, and I can just go ahead and specify in my select statement the join condition between the 2 tables. And in this case, I don't really care what I'm selecting, so I can select something easy like 1. That's going to be essentially a scalar that's going to execute pretty fast. I can do human resources dot job candidate, and this is going to be JC, and that connection is going to be here where I have my business entity ID for my JC. So let's do JC is not null, and the JC.business entity ID is equal to the E.business entity ID. Once I have that, it's essentially going to return to me exactly the same thing that we did when we were using the in condition. If I execute this, I'm getting my 2 rows back. So I'm grabbing everything where I have a match between the 2 tables, and that's going to essentially do the same thing as the inner join. if I want to return everything that doesn't match, I can just change it from an exists to a not exists. And then that's going to return to me everybody that is in the employee table that is not in the job candidates table. And we're going to look at one additional example, and we're going to go back to the slide deck to look at the slide. And this is going to be how we can do all the how the all works keywords. So we have these keywords that are available that we can use with a query. And this is where it gets into the all or the any. And the all is if I have a result set coming back from a subselect that contains a list of values. If I have a condition that's going to be greater than all of them, it's essentially going to pick the largest value, and then everything that is in my query that I'm executing has to have a value that's larger than ever the largest value from that subselect. I have never seen many of these actually being used anywhere, but we're going to at least do one so that we can see what an any looks like. It should be equivalent to some of the other things that we've done. In a lot of cases, people find these confusing, so you don't see them that often used in production. There are other ways around getting some of these query results, but you should take a look at this. And then when we go over to our statement here, we are going to change one of these and use an any. And in this case, this is going to be like our in condition for the most part. So let me go ahead and let's get the in condition. This is the one that we had with the not in. So when we use our not in, we're getting only those rows that are not in this, but in our case, we want to use an equals any. So anytime that we have a business entity ID that equals any of the values that are returned in the subselect, then that's going to be something that we put in the results set. So when we have matches, so I can see that I have my two that are coming back. Anyway, so that's all we have for subqueries. We're going to take a look at common table expressions in the next video.